started final session for today, and our first paper is The Corpus of Australian and New Zealand Spoken English, a new resource of naturalistic speech transcripts by Stephen Coates.
Yes, thank you very much. Good afternoon to everyone. I'm joining you virtually from Oulu in Finland. I'm sorry I don't have the chance to join you in Adelaide. Certainly at this time of year, the weather's nicer in Australia. But yeah, without further ado, let's begin with the slides. So the background of this corpus is that there has been in recent decades a real renaissance in the corpus-based study of English varieties and dialects. And one of the issues with corpus studies of regional language or with dialectology is that some corpora have only limited availability or are quite small in size, which makes it difficult to find rare features or syntactic features, for example, or they may lack sufficient geographical granularity that would allow a broader analysis from a geographical perspective. May be focused only on one location, for example. So if we think about corpora of transcribed speech from Australia and New Zealand, for example, there are several resources available, but some of them are not extremely large in size. They may be specialized for particular sorts of analysis, maybe conversation analysis or that sort of thing. So the basic idea that I've had for creating this corpus and then other similar corpora along these lines is that ASR, automatic speech recognition transcripts, are available pretty much everywhere, as we all know by now. And many of them can be associated with specific geographical locations. So what I've done is taken the ASR transcripts from videos that have been uploaded to YouTube in the channels of local and regional councils. Or other government entities. And I've used this then to create a corpus of Australian and New Zealand speech. So here's a quick example just to get an idea of what we're talking about. This is from the YouTube channel of the Maranoa Regional Council. This is in Queensland. We'll just look at the very beginning of the video.
Councillors, welcome. I'd like to open the meeting at 9:12 a.m. Thank you for your attendance.
So you get the idea. So the ASR captions are then streamed at the bottom of the screen, and many of the videos or the transcripts in the corpus are actually then captions of meetings like this one for Maranoa. Here we see the web VTT. This is video timed text file. This is one of the formats in which the transcripts are available. There are several of them. And basically what happens is that YouTube has an undocumented API called the so-called inner tube. And when one is looking at a video, then all of the different components are then streamed to the viewer. So the video, the dash manifest, and then the little bits of video, and then the transcript file, and then the comments, and then the background images, and so on and so forth. So it's not difficult to then get access to these transcripts. I've created this kind of corpora for several locations. So the first one I created was the Corpus of North American Spoken English. And then I've created one for the British Isles, and then more recently one for Germany in German language, and then this one for Australia and New Zealand. Its size is about 190 million tokens, more than 57,000 transcripts from 482 locations. These are already available for use. They can be downloaded from the Harvard Dataverse. And if you go to my website, my homepage, you can then find links to download these if you're interested. So this is what the data format looks like. It's basically a big table, and then the individual rows represent single transcripts, and then the columns contain various types of metadata. So for example, location, state, the name of the council, the channel name in YouTube, the URL, the video title. This is the YouTube video ID, the date of upload, video length in seconds, and then in this column we have the actual text transcript. I've tagged it with parts of speech using Spacey, and then this is the time offset from the beginning of the video in seconds. Location is then street address and then latitude, longitude coordinates, and then the number of words in that transcript. So why focus on regional and local council channels? There are a few reasons. So first of all, we can be fairly sure that most of the speakers in videos like this are actual local, so they're residents of, Maranoa or wherever else. And this is not necessarily the case if we're looking for content on YouTube based on a search for place names alone. So for example, if we search YouTube for Sydney, then we'll find lots of content that's presumably not made by Sydneysiders and so on. For many of the videos, the topical or the contents of the videos are similar. As I said, there are a lot of recordings of council meetings or committee meetings. There are many interviews with councillors or with local people, well-known local people. There are short news segments. There are other video genres as well, but overall, they're comparable contents. And then another consideration has to do with copyright. In many jurisdictions, this sort of content is considered to be in the public domain, or at least it's available according to fair use or fair dealings provisions in Anglophone copyright law. So in other words, the chances that there would be problems from a copyright perspective might be less than if you were to use material from a big television company or a big movie producer, something like that. So data collection and processing, I identified the relevant channels by getting lists from web pages from the Australian, New Zealand governments, and then scraped all of the lists of local councils for links to YouTube. Then I had a very long list of YouTube channels. And then these I inspected manually to ensure that they were actually YouTube channels of local government entities in Australia or New Zealand. And then I actually retrieved the ASR transcripts using YTDLP. This is a fork of YouTube DL, which is a popular Python repository for interacting with this so-called inner tube from YouTube and getting all of the material that you need. So in this case, the transcript data. The geocoding was done by using Google's geocoding service and then part of speech tagging with Spacey. So here we see then the channel locations. As you can see, there's a pretty good coverage of Australia and New Zealand, at least in terms of the places where people live. By far, the largest subcorpus in the Cohen's corpus is from New Zealand, Christchurch City Council, as you can see, more than 14 million words. Also Hamilton City Council, almost 8 million words. But even if we consider relatively small regional cities in Australia, there are good subcorpus sizes. So Indigo Shire Council, 867,000 words, or here, East Gippy TV, Gippsland in Victoria, more than 1.5 million words, which would then be substantially larger than any existing corpus of transcribed Australian speech. So I think there are a lot of things you can do with this corpus. Here you see an overview of the corpus size by country, state, or territory. And for New Zealand, the way that the council web pages were organized means that I haven't broken them down into individual districts, but of course the location information is in the metadata, so it's not difficult to parse that and then to break down New Zealand into by regions or districts. So what can you do with a corpus? I think there are a lot of things. The corpus is so large that there's a lot of interesting content in there. So one could look at cultural representations, political phenomena, etc. But I'm come from a linguistic background, so I'm more interested in linguistic things. One thing I've been looking at in recent years is a phenomenon known as double modals. This is a rare, non-standard syntactic feature of some spoken English varieties. For example, if I were to say, I could help you with this, obviously in standard English, we only have one modal verb in a verbal phrase. But in the American Southeast and also in the Northern British Isles, this is a syntactic pattern that one sometimes encounters. It's been quite extensively studied. There's a lot of literature about double modals, but most studies are based on non-naturalistic data, typically with a limited geographical scope. So for example, there's data from America from the big 20th century linguistic atlases, so interviews that were conducted with informants. But they only really focused on double modals in areas, so in the Southeast, where they knew it might be something that would be occurring in speech. And they didn't ask these questions, for example, in the Midwest or in the West. I've used the data from the North American and the British Isles corpus to look at this, and I found that the feature is more widely used than previously thought. It's been little studied in Australian and New Zealand speech, as far as I know. In fact, one resource states that it's categorically that it's not a feature that is present in Australian English. So I thought I would take this is a very exploratory study at this stage, but I thought I would take a look. How would we look for double modals in this corpus? Here's a little script, and basically you can just set up a regular expression to look for every possible two-word combination, starting from these base modal verb forms. And then this is going to then look for the double modals here. You see this X index 0, X index 1, those would be the modals, and this other stuff would get the part of speech tags and then the word timing information. And then this would result in a data frame in which every hit in the corpus is then linked to a URL at the exact moment of utterance, or rather a few seconds before the targeted utterance. So it's very easy to then target specific phenomena in this corpus and then have a list of URLs that you can click through and then check what's going on there. So here's an example. I looked at, there are more than 3,000 hits for double modals in this corpus, and I looked at the first few hundred of them. And then I've already filtered out the ones that are not authentic double modals. And we do need to filter out non-authentic double modals. So the first reason is why we need to do that is that some sequences of two modals in speech are simply cases of phrase overlap. So for example, if I were to say, if I might, could I ask you something? So there you have might and could in sequence, but it's obviously not a double modal. And then the other issue, which is also pretty important, is that these are ASR transcripts, so they contain errors. And if the signal quality is poor, then a segment of the audio transcript might be incorrectly transcribed as a modal verb when it's actually not. So here I've already filtered out the ones that are not double modals, and we'll just take a look at a few of them that are double modals. So here's the first one. This is from Dubbo in New South Wales.
And it's very easy to sit back and say, well, we can forget about that plan for a while, and then
sit back and say, well, we'll can forget about that. So we can forget about that. So that's one example. And then here is another example from Inner West, that's in Sydney.
Finding them, but I think normally people might just hide their avalanche transceiver.
So people might just hide the avalanche transceiver. In this case, we have then captions that have been embedded in the video file, and these are not the ASR captions, those are manually created captions. So I think you get the idea. There seem to be double modals in Australia, and there's certainly a lot of them in New Zealand as well. Now, other things you can do with this corpus. So if you're looking at a feature which is relatively common, or a set of features which are common, so lexical types, for example, then you can train classifiers. So I tested a classifier in scikit, support vector machines classifier based on the 500 most common words in the corpus. And these were not, there weren't any place names or anything that would obviously then tip off the classifier. These were mostly then function words and then common lexical verbs and nouns and things like that. You can see then here the results. It's a fairly accurate. It suggests to me there might be something going on in terms of lexical bundles or perhaps characteristic expressions that are being used then differently in Australia and New Zealand that might be worth looking into a little bit more carefully. And then the third thing I wanted to mention, and this is not something that's in the short paper, is that with this corpus, it's very easy to set up a pipeline for acoustic analysis using the same basic method. So use regular expressions to target a specific word or phrase, and then extract that audio span directly from the YouTube stream using YTDLP. Then this audio can be fed to a forced aligner along with the transcript, and then the desired sounds can be extracted. So I've done this very provisionally. We're looking here, or I've extracted then some instances of the word today in Australian and New Zealand English. This is kind of interesting because, of course, then the vowel, the nucleus of this diphthong in some varieties of Australian English can be quite low and quite back compared to, for example, American English or British English varieties. So let's take a look at how people are saying today in Adelaide.
Today. 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 Today.
Today.
All right, you get the idea, but you can do this for any word or any sequence you want to. And then obviously then this is could be suitable then for phonetic analysis. Here we see then based on a very small sample of today's, there are thousands and thousands of today's, and I've only looked at the first ones, but here we see then the A diphthong in formant space, and you can see that at least in this data, it seems like it's in the Northern Territories where it has the lowest nucleus. So maybe they're saying to die up there in the Northern Territories. If we look at the other regions, it's quite similar, but for example, in Tasmania or in the ACT, it doesn't seem to be quite as low, the nucleus. All right, a few caveats. Obviously, this corpus is a specialized genre of spoken interaction, and then videos of local government are not representative of speech in general. So we can't say that this is how Australians speak or this is how New Zealanders speak. There are lots of types of speech that are not represented in this corpus. What about the ASR errors? So I have done a provisional calculation of a word error rate, and I found it a value of about 14%. This is based on videos where both ASR and manually uploaded transcripts exist. However, the issue with that is that you don't know 100% that the manual uploaded transcripts are not also simply ASR from some different algorithm. That's actually quite frequent. So in any case, this is a fairly low word error rate. The word error rate is related to the quality of the audio, as well as some dialect features. The way to address this, as I've suggested, is for low frequency phenomena, you can look at the actual speech signal in the videos, as I did for double modals. And then for high frequency phenomena, it's simply the fact that the signal of correct transcriptions in the corpus will almost always be higher than the signal of any given incorrect transcription for a word. And that means that we can use then this stronger signal then, for example, to train classifiers or do other things. All right, with that, that's all about I wanted to say. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to any comments or questions you might have. And there are some references. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Do we have any questions? Yes, David.
So two things related to the double modal. So I didn't really hear the first video well enough, but the second video, there was a catch after the would. So it was they would, glottal stop, might, and it seemed like a correction to me.
Yeah, that's certainly the case, that it's always kind of a matter of judgment when you're going through then these individual videos and trying to determine whether or not they're double modals. So the criteria that I've used when looking at this is there a perceptible pause? And if there's not a perceptible pause, so no interruption of the speech signal, then I've by default then categorized it as a double modal. But here for this one, yeah, maybe there is a pause and I didn't hear it. Let's see, let's listen again.
Finding them, but I think normally people might just hide their avalanche transcripts.
Yeah, there's something, maybe a little something going on there, but maybe some sort of correction or repair going on. But yeah, that is an important issue. So you have to have consistent criteria for determining whether or not it's a correction or if it's actually an authentic, then double modal. But
And the other thing is I wanted to give another example. Should might prevail over right.
should might prevail. Yeah, is that a common common usage?
Might over right is a common usage, and so I mean that should. The thing is, there are certain modals that have nominal homonyms, homophones. So your automatic transcription might catch some of them.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, so for example, in some of the videos that I looked at from North America, there are cases of the personal name Will. So Will, could you come over here? Will, could you turn on my my video or something like that? And there you have a will and a could. Will could. So you have to filter those ones out as well. But you're quite right. They're homophones as well. So when you're looking at these videos, you have to filter out those sorts of things. But yeah, that's right.
Are there any other questions? Any questions online? I've got one question, which is, are you planning to keep this building as an ongoing resource?
I've thought about that. It takes, I haven't really come up with a good method to automate all of the different steps in a way that everything is kind of self-regulating. So getting all of the data then from the YouTube inner tube, and then kind of doing the filtering, and then converting the web VTT into then the format that I need, and all of those things. So I would probably need to think about how to put that up in a pipeline. But yeah, of course, that would be something good as well, because these channels are continually uploading new content, and having it, updating this resource would make it more useful, more valuable. But yeah, that's a good consideration.
Looks like we've got one more question.
The video itself is a resource. Sometimes for the chairman, you might get good lip reading possibilities or gestures or other things. So is the video available and synchronized well enough? Yeah,
that's a good point as well. So I think really one of the real advantages of this corpus and then the other ones that I've created is that because they're linked to, so the word timing information is linked to the individual lexical items, and the video and audio are available publicly, you can get that immediately from this YouTube inner tube. And so that's what I've done. With the word today. So for example, just getting that, but you can do the exact same thing for the video as well. So if you're looking at, so for example, how people might be changing their gestures after particular questions, so emphatic questions, then you could do that as well. You could get a lot of videos in which that is going on. Of course, a lot of the videos would not necessarily have interesting visual content or gesticulation that might be analyzable, but potentially it's in there. So yeah, absolutely. So the multimodality, I think, is an important potential use case for this corpus.
Okay, thanks very much. Please thank our speaker.
Thank you.